Good morning. I'm Scott Duda, and thank you for joining us for our law firm digital transformation, the last in this series on protecting your business. I'm an audit partner with Bekaert, and I also lead our professional services industry group. With me today are two Dans, Dan Sembler and Dan Hulen, both directors in our digital advisory and risk assurance practices. Dan Hulen, can you start by introducing yourself?
Sure. Thanks, Scott. I'm Dan Hulen. I'm a director, as Scott said, in our digital advisory services. Had a lot of decades of experience across the IT space in global IT and software infrastructure, security, analytics. And today, I help organizations both define what does this mean for digital transformation for their business, and then how it might be leveraged, especially in insights, growth initiatives, and operational effectiveness. Glad to be here. Thanks.
Thanks. Dan Sembler?
Hey, Scott, thanks for having me. I'm Dan Sembler. I'm also a director in our risk assurance and advisory practice, specifically the information assurance and cybersecurity domain. I've been with the firm for over 12 years and specialize most of my time now in helping middle market, quickly growing technology companies prepare for various cybersecurity standards, third-party attestations, any type of third-party or vendor requirements they're going to have to prepare or actually audit on in the security domain.
Excellent. So I know we see and hear things about cybersecurity and hacks and lost data, ransomware. It's in the news every day. We read about it. When we see those things, it's a lot of financial services. It's a lot of professional services. And, I think our customers and clients expect a higher level of data integrity and security from us than maybe some others. So for both of you, and we'll start with Dan Sembler, what are some of the major risks that law firms are seeing today as it relates to protecting their data?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Scott. We see this question all the time. One of the things that Dan Hulen and I wanted to bring forward, for contextual reasons, is actually an annual survey that goes out from Marsh. Specifically the 2021 edition. They did an annual legal business risk survey where respondents are asked to respond and say, where are you worried? What impacts from a cyber or a technological breach perspective could have a significant impact on your organization? And their responses are focused at the top around IT security breaches and losing or inadvertently disclosing commercially sensitive commercially sensitive data or information, right? They're also noting significant risks or impacts related to workforce availability. Everybody's seeing this across the board, even outside of professional services, right? They're also noting specific concerns about data privacy, or how do they make sure that they're complying with their vendor or contractual requirements with regards to destruction of data? How long do they have to keep stuff, right? Last two things I want to make sure we notice here, just because it does set some context for our discussion today, is related to the financial systems and how they can ensure their ongoing integrity, so they're not compromised, leading to direct financial loss or a hindrance to their own growth, right? And then lastly, reputational damage. How do they protect their firm, right? How do they make sure they're not connected with an unsavory or unethical client or client activity that ultimately has a negative impact or repercussion on their business?
Yeah, Dan, I just want to weigh in there as well. One of the other things that was noted and very important is in probability of these things happening. IT security breaches don't happen every day, but other things do. In the IT context, we often talk about doing risk management and thinking about, well, what are you going to do when a serious attack hits your business? But the probability of the electricity going out in your data center is more probable. So from a legal context, the probability of procedural oversights, failure to complete the key step in a process, failure to keep track of when a critical step in the legal process has to be conducted, on what date things have to be filed, internal process failures like lost documents, the wrong attachment went out, processes are completed with simple errors like typographical or wrong dates are entered, or the failure to warn a client of potential risks and costs associated with a course of action. These are day-to-day operational things that law firms face in particular, and we definitely want to hit on that in terms of risk mitigation and impacts on negligence claims.
So let's start with the five impacts that we talked about, and then we can dig in on the negligence situations. But so what can firms do to prevent these security breaches?
Yeah, absolutely. Again, a common question, Scott, and I want to circle back to, even in our introduction here, the questions that we're continuing to receive and some of the top responses to that March survey related to impacts are all around, ransomware and phishing and some of these things.
Mhm.
These are what we see keep popping up in the news, right? And the first thing we always remind organizations of, law firms in particular, is that the front line of any cyber risk management program or protection is really your employees. It's the human element, right? They're the ones that are transacting, interacting with clients and data, sending information here and there, right? So it's really important to have a standardized, robust information security program that's going to push out requirements, training protocols, both at the time of hire and annually thereafter, or as your contractual requirements may require. If you have particularly sensitive data, or if you have access to, say, EPHI or any type of particularly sensitive data like that, you may have to do it more often. It may behoove you to do it, say, quarterly or semi-annually. You may also have to have some special tools or protocols where you're exchanging data or storing data, absolutely. But the training of your employees to make sure that they're following the protocols that your firm has in place is really where you're going to want to focus on first. On top of that, you're also going to want to have a strong incident response policy. You want to have your plan documented before you're ever under fire or in a situation. So you have the decision tree already lined out. You already have your steps, how you're going to recover, how you're going to respond, how you're going to detect. Everything is already written down ahead of time, right? Lastly, you want to make sure that you have strong encryption and authentication controls around your critical infrastructure or wherever your confidential data resides. You're going to think about things like encryption. These are things you're probably used to hearing about, right? Encryption both of data at rest in your environments, or if you're relying on a third party, how are they encrypting your data on your behalf, right? And how are you exchanging data with both those third parties and your clients? We need to have a lot of assurance there, and also make sure you have those strong authentication controls. So are you able to implement some type of multi-factor authentication? Are you able to implement encryption of service account passwords? Do you have a key pass management system? These are all things you can do to help increase the protections that you have around the authentication of those critical systems.
So the human element you mentioned, right? Like they're the weak link. That's why I get all those test phishing emails from our IT group, right? Okay, so what about data privacy and destruction of data? What advice would you give legal practice clients there?
Thanks, Scott. This has many dimensions, of course. The first thing with respect to data privacy, destruction of data, the management of data is to right size it for the organization. The needs of a 10-person law firm are distinct from a 500-person firm that's doing international work. On the data privacy front, the adherence to privacy laws, they become so much more complex. I'm sure our legal customers, clients know this, but especially so for direct-to-consumer companies, which law firms are in some respects, but others do need to pay attention to these because the practices are still helpful and identify what we call the golden eggs, defining where are those key parts of your business that you need to protect, and to know also how to respond in case of a breach. So knowing where you're collecting personal information and where the data lives. For example, you may have customer or client data in HubSpot, Constant Contact for emailing, CRM solutions, your practice management solution on-premise, and public file systems or cloud-based file systems. You may have that customer data in a lot of different places. So knowing where it is really important. And also then ensuring that your policies are published, the opt-out forms, the process to deal with customer requests under the California Consumer Privacy Act and other states, as well as GDPR. Going a little bit further on that, and data privacy and getting to the management of data, including destruction of data, are a host of what I would call infrastructure considerations. And this is the basic blocking and tackling and the tactics of dealing with implementing your risk management program and strategies, and that's identity and access, right? Making sure that everybody's authenticating, you have multi-factor authentications going on, and you have role-based security inside your data systems, practice management systems, cloud solutions, and so forth. Having an information architecture, it kind of gets back to that, where does data live? It's important to have that outlined. and to do that deliberately so that when new people come into your organization, they can be joined to a group, and that group then gives them access to particular resources and not others. Coming onto that is also practices in data retention, so that information is tagged automatically, and the backend systems can remove that data from your environment, whether it be, again, file systems or emails or chats, and these types of areas. Data management and labeling, the tagging of documents, for example, that are related to a matter, related to a client, and so you can better protect information. And using that data labeling can also implement tools like data loss prevention, so that when a sensitive document is tagged, that it doesn't go out through general email. It goes out in email, but it switches over and sends a link that's an encrypted link to a virtual mailbox that a person can interact with for the transfer of sensitive data. Obviously, utilization of portals is helpful there too. The encryption is also an important tactic here for the protection of data. If people do not, if our clients do not have encryption out on their endpoints, meaning their PCs and also their mobile devices, then we advise them to get that sorted, and then finally backup and recovery. Knowing where the data goes from a data protection perspective, and is it encrypted? And also, is there an air gap? This is a major problem. We deal with cybersecurity incidents where the bad guys are hanging out in the network for a long time, and they find out where the backups are. There's not an air gap between them. There's not a separate authentication. It's the same authentication that your administrator is using, but they've got access to the administrator accounts now, and then can get to the backups and get rid of them before they go further.
Yeah, one of my clients knows all too well that issue of not having separate security around a backup system. So I know earlier in our discussion, we talked about reputational risk. What can firms do to mitigate that or offset that or protect themselves?
Yeah, thanks, Scott. Again, a common question, and typically where we'll see these questions kind of reside or revolve is around ESG, the environmental, societal, or governance risks, and what can firms do or service organizations do to protect themselves, right? So the first thing they're going to want to do is have a robust process in place to identify new risks or reevaluate previously existing risks that have been identified during previous practices. Typically, they're going to want to have that process execute at least annually. Think of it as an enterprise risk management or just an overarching risk assessment type process that they can execute. Certainly, if they don't feel like they have the expertise in-house, there are plenty of providers externally that can help them through that process. You're going to want to think about things, especially in this ESG realm. These are some of the emerging risks, like what are we doing to evaluate our oncoming customers, our oncoming clients, and where their values lie, and do they lie in line with our firm's values? We see all sorts of examples in the public domain of where there are clashes in these values between an organization who is providing a service and a customer or a client who is receiving it, right? And how are firms evaluating that relationship? How are firms evaluating those values, right? And how are we making decisions about who we're doing business with and who we're associated with, and what's the reputational fallout from that? After identifying a population of risks, not just related to ESG, typically you're going to want this to be an overarching thing, right? But after you've identified your population of risks, that's where you really have to go through a strong process of identifying your existing processes, or in my domain, we'd call these controls, right? Existing controls that you have to mitigate those risks. All right, the power is going to go out. What do we do to mitigate the risk of the power going out? All right, an ESG risk, what are we going to do to mitigate or identify those risks, right? Then you have to evaluate what the ongoing effectiveness is of those processes or of those controls to actually mitigate those risks, to reduce the residual risk to your firm, right? And then you have a decision to make. That's where you spend most of your time, working with your vendors, your partners, your executive leadership teams to say, all right, here's our library of risks. Here's everything we've done to mitigate or try to control some of those risks. Here's where our residual risk lies. And are we comfortable with that? Or do we have to implement some new policies or some new processes or some new controls? Or do we have to execute another vendor, right? Do we have to accept a risk? Is it as low as we can get it, and for business purposes, this is as far as we can go? Or do we want to transfer some of that risk vis-a-vis insurance or to another third party, right?
Yeah, I appreciate that. On reputational risk, in addition, there's the key processes, law firms and general counsels and other companies have to deal with in their operations, such as conflict of interest inquiries or know your customer, anti-money laundering requirements. And, thankfully, there are some software-based solutions that can do this or be enhanced to conduct those processes, with greater automation.
Good, good. So let's talk about that business process automation. How does that reduce risk?
Yeah, this is an important area. I mentioned that before in terms of probability, those procedural oversights, the failures to diarize or, action the time critical legal steps, the internal process failure, the process is completed, but you've got simple errors like typographical or wrong dates are entered, failure to warn a client of potential risks. The key takeaway for us, and an area where we also get engaged beyond the traditional cybersecurity and infrastructure considerations that I mentioned before, is that a law firm, just as any organization, is going to compete and lower risk at the same time as apply more process standardization and especially automation, for their company. And I want to distinguish here. We have got two kinds: business process automation and robotic process automation. The typical business process or workflows you see a lot in organizations that are routing forms around, getting approvals, and those types of things. But RPA, robotic process automation, is bringing a whole nother dimension of quality and capability to this area of reducing waste, reducing errors, and so forth. So in the law firm context, here's some process automation opportunities: scheduling appointments, making sure that your clients can see what's available and they can do some auto scheduling. Making sure that you have digital signature capabilities and automation there to get contracts signed and other things. Related to contract management, like identifying contracts that were requiring review and the termination dates are set properly, the accepting or rejecting contract changes based on some parameters of non-negotiables. Document generation and creating drafts, not just from templates anymore, but imagine creating drafts that are harvesting data from government websites. Like the robot is logging in on your behalf with your credentials or with some other shared credentials, and it's grabbing information automatically and filling in your your templates with that information, or going into your practice management solution and filling it in. These are very sophisticated robots that are able to do this. Here's another one: creating digests for changes in the code of law or regulatory compliance, and leveraging that not only for internal use, but also a means of publishing to your customer base, right? Maybe you could monetize that as well. Handling the privacy requests, handling GDPR requests, handling foreign export controls, handling H-1B visas, self-service NDAs. I mean, these robots can do a lot. And in all those applications, these are just really good examples of how to use the technology to reduce the errors and thus reduce the claims for negligence. They obviously have the added benefit, too, of it's eliminating waste, it's eliminating time. It's also inherently generating more value because of the accuracy, customer satisfaction, increased margins through productization. For example, you think that in H-1B visas and so forth, that you could use a robot to 100% make every application accurate and not have things going back and forth. So that's super valuable.
So what other things should firms be thinking about? What other practices would help them reduce risk and protect the business? Anything else that we should be thinking about?
Yeah. Well, another way, and it's again kind of getting to automation and so forth, and controlling data, is finding ways to move away from email, into a client or a matter portal. That's another way to lower risk, because if you've designed with a process mindset and you have tasks that are organized and comments are included, it also gives some personnel time back to work on more strategic issues. Less time responding to basic inquiries that clients are prone to make. Further, I would just say protecting your business is that transfer or that redirecting at risk.
What do you mean there by redirecting that risk?
Well, fundamentally, law firms do this really well, and giving counsel is shifting risk to third parties, that are specializing in process and outsourcing instead of trying to solve this myself.
Right. Yeah, Scott. Insurance is a good example of transfer or redirection of risk, right? And one of the emerging things that we're seeing throughout the professional services industry is that, there's an expectation that some type of general liability or general practitioner's insurance is going to provide some coverage for specific cyber breaches or incidences. And in our experience, and in our customers or our clients' experiences, that's really not usually true. You know this, right? Insurance companies are going to find any reason that they can to get out of assisting or providing some coverage for something that is determined to be out of scope from your coverage, right? So you're going to want to make sure from the protection perspective, from the protection perspective, that you're executing specific cyber liability or cyber protection insurance policies that'll give you some protection, some coverage for common occurrences should you have to engage them for, say, notification of data breaches to customers, or restoring identities to affected individuals, or helping your organization recover from your data being compromised or stolen. How do you get the business back up and running? And then finally, you want to think about having some coverage under that policy for the repairing of damaged computer systems or networking equipment that you just need, again, to get back up on your feet, get the doors open, and get business rolling again.
Right. So, we've not only read articles and seen headlines on all of this. I mean, at this point, it's so common. We've all experienced it, or we know clients or customers that have experienced it. It's not going away. And so Dan and Dan, really thank you both for all this information. It's been very enlightening and I think helpful in really helping us to think about this. How do we protect our business? Appreciate everybody listening to us today, and our contact information for the three of us is included where you access the podcast. Please let us know how we can be your guide forward. Look forward to talking to you again.
Thanks very much.